The objective of this video is that the student will be able to explain what a monopoly is, what a monopoly looks like, and who are some of the players of the Gilded Age that participated in this monopoly behavior in business. In order to first understand why monopolies even occurred or why people thought they were okay and the reason people treated business people certain ways is to first to look at social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is this new law. Now, it's not a law as in that it's in the books, and if you don't follow it, you're going to go to jail. But business owners and businessmen followed this as the way to succeed. Social Darwinism comes from Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, that the weak will go to the wayside and the strong and the smart and the intelligent will survive. What would happen is in the factories and in these businesses, if you didn't succeed, it must mean that you are weak, and it is better for society if you fall to the wayside anyway. And that will allow for the strong to emerge, making it a better country. There are a lot of problems with this because business owners used it to justify low wages and long hours. If you can't handle the long hours and the low wages, then you must not be very strong and you must be weak. It also justified something called laissez-faire, which translates into free to do. Some people thought that government should step in and set regulations or rules or guidelines that businesses should follow, meaning people could only work so many hours and that they should be provided with protection. But laissez-faire is the exact opposite of that many business owners believe that their business should be free to do whatever they want, and that the government should not intervene. Because of this natural process of social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, the strong would succeed and make it have a positive impact on the United States. Andrew Carnegie will become, sometimes pronounced Andrew Carnegie, will become one of these large business owners that really represents what a monopoly owner looks like, or a robber baron, which we'll talk about in a second. But Andrew Carnegie really is the American dream story. He immigrated to the United States from Scotland when he was just 13 years old. His family was very, very poor. And at the age of 13, he started as a bobbin boy working in one of the factories. A bobbin boy would work in a textile mill, and he'd bring the bobbins to the women and collect the full bobbins of spun cotton or wool. He would also fix minor problems with machines. Andrew Carnegie only made $1 a week being a bobbin boy, and he would work from 5:30 in the morning till 7:30 at night, 6 days a week. So he worked really, really hard as a young boy. But he had a goal for himself, and he made a plan for himself. He moved from a bobbin boy to be a telegrapher, and the money he made, he invested it. He invested it in the railroad. And then he used money he made off his investments in the railroad to invest in steel. He would then enter the steel business in 1873. This is where Carnegie would become one of the richest men in the world. In 1899, he forms what is known as Carnegie Steel. And at this point, Carnegie is controlling almost all of the steel in the United States, creating a monopoly on the steel. The company manufactured more steel than all the factories in Great Britain combined. He was a steel tycoon. He was also a philanthropist. A philanthropist is someone who gives to charity, helps others. He donated a lot to libraries. He also donated to arts programs in the city to help build up society. So how exactly does a bobbin boy go from making $1 to a week to controlling all the steel in the United States? Well, he's going to form a monopoly. And there are two ways, and Carnegie does a little bit of both, two ways to form a monopoly. You can either do it through horizontal integration. That's going from think of east to west across. The sun is on the horizon. That's going to be the flat line. Or you can use vertical integration, and that is up and down. Horizontal integration companies were producing similar products and merge. And so Carnegie would buy out other steel companies. And so complete horizontal integration is when you own all of the steel companies. And so Carnegie attempted to buy out competing steel companies, and they couldn't compete with his prices, so they had to sell to him. And once he bought up all the steel, he hiked up the prices once more. He also used a little bit of vertical integration. Once he had a strong hold on steel, he also tried to vertically integrate. So he would buy all the companies and factories that produced in the making of the steel, the delivery of the steel. So vertical integration is the process of buying out suppliers in order to control the raw materials and transportation systems. So if he's going to do vertical integration with steel, he's going to own the refinery. He's going to own the actual steel production. He's going to own the transportation. He's going to own all of those aspects so that he doesn't have to pay anyone else for that business. So here's a visual that can kind of show you what vertical integration looks like versus horizontal integration. And like Carnegie, he kind of had a little bit of both. He started with vertical and, he started with horizontal and then moved to vertical. So you can see if you are doing vertical integration and you are starting a meat industry, you're going to sell hamburger meat. In order to completely monopolize on that through vertical integration, you would have to own the cattle. You would have to own the slaughterhouse where the cattle are killed and butchered. You would have to own railroad cars and the railroad and the shipping to ship the butchered meat. You would have to own warehouses to store the meat. You'd have to own the packing plants, and you would have to also own the delivery wagons. How are you going to deliver that? If you own every single one of those processes, then you have a vertical integrated monopoly on the meat industry. Now you can see in horizontal integration, you have one large oil company, and that oil company was established by buying smaller oil companies so that eventually that business owner controls all the oil in the United States. So if we're going to use an analogy, how would this look like if McDonald's did vertical integration or horizontal integration? So if McDonald's was to do vertical integration and to have a monopoly on fast food hamburgers, they would, very similar to the vertical integration, have to own the cattle, the agricultural fields to grow the vegetables that they use on their hamburgers. They would have to own the slaughterhouses. They'd have to have warehouses to store the food. They'd have to own trucks to transport the foods back and forth. They would have to own the restaurants, all in order to create vertical integration. Now, if McDonald's was going to do horizontal integration, they would buy up all the smaller fast food restaurants. So they would buy up Burger King. They would buy up Hardee's. They would buy up let's see, what else is there? Burger King, Hardee's, Wendy's. They would buy up all of those fast food hamburger places in order to control all of the fast food hamburgers in the United States. So the textbook definition, so one of the objectives is that you'll be able to define a monopoly, is that it's complete control over its industry, production, wages, and prices. That is a monopoly. Now, monopolies are legal today, but during the Gilded Age, it was free game and you could do whatever you wanted when it came to controlling businesses. I'm going to talk about 3 people that had monopolies during the Gilded Age. We've already talked about Carnegie, but the 3 I'm going to talk about now are J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, J.P. Morgan is going to do it a little bit different. He's going to create what's known as a holding company, and he's going to do this to eventually control steel. He will create a company where he buys out other companies, steel companies, in order to create his own steel monopoly. Now, you're like, well, I thought you said Carnegie controlled steel. Well, he did. J.P. Morgan actually bought Carnegie Steel from J.P. Morgan actually bought Carnegie Steel from Carnegie in 1901. J.P. Morgan paid a total of $480 million for Carnegie Steel when he bought it and made Carnegie the richest man. Today, that would be about a $13.6 billion business. Once he bought Carnegie Steel, J.P. Morgan had a monopoly on it and renamed it United States Steel. John D. Rockefeller is going to use horizontal integration, meaning he's going to buy out other companies. And he is going to do this in order to control the oil in the United States. He did this by making mergers where he joined competing companies in trust agreements. He controlled 90% of oil refining business, which is a lot, so he was able to control those prices. And he kept costs down by paying very low wages to his workers. Cornelius Vanderbilt is going to create a monopoly in shipping through ships and railroads. Vanderbilt started out by owning his own very own ferry business. A ferry is a type of boat, at the age of 16 in Staten Island, that ran a ferry from Staten Island to New York. He would then save his money, invest his money so that he could start controlling railroads and ships. Interesting fact about Vanderbilt is that he married his first cousin and had 13 children. He also is the one that gave the initial gift to start and found Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, making him also a philanthropist. As time went on, many people started to notice that monopolies were having a negative impact on society, contrary to what the business owners were saying about the business law of survival, social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and laissez-faire. And many people started to argue the detriment that monopolies were creating. So what exactly is wrong with a monopoly? Well, if one person owns something, they're not necessarily competing. So right now, if I want a fast food hamburger, I have tons of choices. And because I have tons of choices, everybody is competing for my business. So they keep the prices down and the quality up. But if I only have one fast food hamburger place to go to, they don't have to keep the price down. So monopolies lead to high prices. Monopolies also lead to a lack of research and a lack of development. So people aren't trying to improve their product because they're not competing with someone to try to get you to buy that product. Think of cell phones today and how cell phone companies are constantly researching and improving development of technology so that you will buy their cell phone. It's because they are competing. But if there was only one cell phone that you could buy, that competition wouldn't be there to lead to that development and research. So in 1890, you have what is known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, and a trust is just a way of making monopolies. So antitrust would be anti-monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 made it illegal to form a trust or a monopoly that interfered with free trade between states or with other countries. Now, this law, while it is a first step towards breaking up monopolies, it is not an effective law because what exactly a trust is isn't clearly defined, and someone could change the wording in what they are and the definition of what they are, and they would say, oh, we're not a trust. And so it made them very hard to prosecute. The Sherman Antitrust Act is still in play today. In fact, in 2001, plaintiffs alleged that Microsoft abused monopoly power on Intel-based personal computer devices in its handling of operating systems. Many people thought that the only operating system you had was Windows, and that was the only choice you had. And because of that, Microsoft had a monopoly. Winner of the browser wars because it was bundled with Internet Explorer, and it ruled yes, it was a monopoly. So because it was bundled with Internet Explorer and it didn't give you any other choices for a browser, the government ruled that yes, it was a monopoly. So in order to stop it, they said you can sell Windows, but you have to sell the software separate for the Internet Searching Committee. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is still in effect today. Now, because a lot of these business owners would cut wages, give people really, really long hours, they were called robber barons because they were really, really, really rich. Many people saw them stealing from the masses and making them super poor while those people were making them money. Another side of it is that they're a captain of industry. They're really pushing forward America's business. They're making America a strong economic presence in the world. They also saw themselves as philanthropists, like we talked about earlier, starting building libraries, starting universities. Like we talked about Vanderbilt. We also talked University of Chicago was started by one of the capitalists of the Gilded Age. But then they're living in these huge houses, like you see. Let me get my pen out. This house right here, this is Biltmore, which is just in Biltmore Estate, which is just over in Asheville, North Carolina. And this house was built for 3 people, and it's an absolute mansion. You could almost call it a castle because it is so big. And the Vanderbilts are living in a house like this, where the workers are living in these poor conditions. So you could argue that they're robber barons, or you could argue that they're captains of industry. As criticism for monopolies grew, people started drawing political cartoons to criticize the role of business. Now, whenever you look at a political cartoon, you need to ask yourself three main questions. What can I see? What can I infer? And what can I conclude? We have some more questions here that break it down a little bit. But what are some of the words and symbols that you see in this cartoon? Now, you might want to pause this and really kind of look at it, because these political cartoons are going to be on your test, and you need to be able to recognize that. You notice that some of the first things that pop up to me is, it's Rockefeller, because you see his name right here. You also see that you have Washington, D.C. here. He has Washington, D.C. in his hands. And if we remember, Rockefeller is in control of oil, and you can see oil burning back here. The actions I see is he's holding D.C. in his hands. What is some possible symbolism in the cartoon? If I see a man kind of holding Washington, he is controlling business decisions, he's controlling government decisions in order to help his government grow. It really makes Rockefeller look bad in this cartoon. So I would say that the opinion of the artist is that he has a negative opinion on monopolies, and that I would say the main point is that monopolies are having a negative effect on government. Since we've already looked at one political cartoon, what I would like you to do is pause this video and see if you can answer these questions in analyzing this political cartoon, breaking it apart piece by piece in order to see the bigger meaning of this particular political cartoon. If you get stuck, please do not hesitate to ask your teacher if you need help. Also, just to make sure that you're on the right track, because you will have to analyze political cartoons not only on your module assessment but also on your end of the year state assessment as well. One of the primary documents that we see here in the Gilded Age, primary source is a document from the time period, and this is going to be the Gospel of Wealth. It was written in 1889 by Andrew Carnegie, and he writes what he thinks how money should be spent. People that have extra money, how should they spend it? So as we read it, these are some of the questions I want you to think about. Just by going by the title, what do you think the Gospel of Wealth is about? Knowing what you know about Carnegie, what do you think are Carnegie's beliefs about wealth? And so we're obviously not in class right now, but I want you to analyze it. I'm going to have an excerpt for you in a second. And as I read it out loud, think about these questions. What do you think the Gospel of Wealth is about? Knowing what you know about Carnegie, what do you think his beliefs are going to be? So think about those two questions. You might want to pause it before we go. So pause it, think about those two questions, and then we'll get into the Gospel of Wealth. So here's an excerpt from Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. I'm going to read it real quick for you. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, that the ties of brotherhood may still bind together the rich and poor in harmonious relationship. The conditions of human life have not only been changed, but revolutionized within the past few hundred years. In former days, there was little difference between the dwelling, dress, food, and environment of the chief and those of his retainers. The contrast between the palace of the millionaire and the cottage of the laborer with us today measures the change which has come with civilization. This change, however, is not to be deplored, but we welcomed as highly beneficial. It is essential for the progress of the race that the houses of some should be homes for all, that is the highest and best in literature and the arts, and for all the refinements of civilization, rather than that should be so. Much better this great irregularity than universal squalor. Without wealth there can be no Maecenas. So reading that, I want you to pause it, take a time, just kind of look at it, underline things that you think stand out, that you think lead to the main point. Think about what you see, what can you infer, and what can you conclude. And the main idea, what I really want you to be able to conclude, is what is Carnegie's view on wealth. Now I'm going to give that to you, but what I want you to do is underline some evidence in this excerpt to back that up. So Carnegie's view is that money should just not be given away. That if you see somebody homeless on the side of the street, you just shouldn't give it to them because you don't know how they're going to spend it. Instead, rich people should give their money to the arts and to museums so that civilization, so the whole can benefit for it. And you know when you do that how your money is being spent.